The audience is mostly going to be white first-year college students. And so you always have to pay attention to your audience when you're making your statements. You need to be very careful about how you represent people, given who is probably going to be reading your work, who your audience is. And we all know that many people have stereotypes about other people, perhaps in places like Africa, or maybe even closer to home. And while you cannot control how people will read your work, you don't have complete control over what somebody's going to do with it. We all know that we say things, and the next thing you know, somebody misinterprets us and goes off in a totally different direction, and you can't control that. But on the other hand, you shouldn't be naive about it. If you know that there's a stereotype about certain people being dumb or being smart, you don't just go and play into that or potentially play into that. You have to watch out for that. So I'm super glad now that I have assigned this article in cultural anthropology at this high level of smartness. But today we're talking about language. That's our main topic. Now, what is language? Guess says that language is a system of communication that conveys information using symbols, such as words, sounds, and gestures, organized according to certain rules. First of all, I want to be clear about the abstract symbols, the importance that human languages rely on systems of sounds and rules about those sounds and words, which are not connected to the things they represent in some physical way. So whether I call that table or I start talking about it as a mesa, there's nothing about that object which makes me use a different word for it. Let's see, I was just trying a Spanish word. Anybody got a different word for this object? Any other words we might use in a different language for this thing there? Yeah, anybody got some French? Well, that sounds too familiar. Anybody got a word they know about this thing? Where's that?
German.
German. We're bringing in some German here.
That's what I took in high school.
That's what you did in high school. So even among what we might call the European languages, we have some quite different words for this thing. There is nothing natural about this thing which makes us call it a tisch, a table, or a mesa, or whatever the French call it. Right? There's nothing about it that suggests that. There's nothing about the word dog that has to do with its furriness or its barkiness or the sounds that it makes that makes us use the word dog as opposed to the word perro or chien or hund or different words for these things. So it's very important. The abstractness of these symbols is very important. That said, see, can't even talk. The emotional content has not gone away from language. And so the emotions in which we say things and the ways in which we do what is called paralanguage and kinesics and gestures and all those things is crucial to how a sentence is interpreted. Yes, give us a great example here. The sentence, the exam is on Thursday, and then he asks you to use each of these tones of voice, to say it happy, to say it sad, angry, tired, scared, disgusted, or enthusiastic. So you can take the same exact symbolic words, and they can convey very different meanings depending on our tone. And so oftentimes we want to think that our emotional, our guttural sounds and that emotion has disappeared from language, but in fact, it's very much necessary to know what people are talking about. What do we need in our text so we know what people are talking about? What do we need? Yeah. Turns out that text and writing in general is very difficult if you don't have something to know. Are you mad? Are you smiling? Are you saying this sarcastically? And then human beings, we level onto those things. So then you might send an emoji that indicate something, but you don't know if that person is actually using that emoji sarcastically or not. And then I learned that you should never end a text with a period, because then your relationship is basically over. So I've been learning about those things, trying to understand different emojis and emotional connections of things, but we need that in order to convey meaning through language. Now, as we were talking about a little bit, language is going to be patterned. So the ways in which we know what a word means has to do with the system within which it resides. And so there are certain rules about language. Most of them we internalize without even knowing it. So by the time we're 2 or 3 years old, we're starting to be able to speak in complete sentences and those kinds of things without ever understanding necessarily the rules by which they are governed. And humans have an incredible capacity to layer on symbols on top of symbols. As we talk with the emojis, you develop those and create different ones and have different interpretations for all of these gestures. Very importantly, those patterns are learned. And so we can learn new languages. We don't just genetically have one language that we learn. Whatever society that we grow up in, that is the language or languages that we are going to learn. And what do we know about these languages? What do they do? Yeah. Again, using that term dynamic. So they're always changing over time, they adapt. And it's really a sign of how humans are very creative and flexible creatures. What does this remind you of? Something that is patterned, patterns that we learn, dynamic, changing over time. What does it start to sound like? Yeah.
Culture?
Culture? Yeah, absolutely. It mirrors cultures. There's a very, in some ways, if you can understand language, you're also in many ways understanding the principles of culture. There's a interrelated dynamic to those. Like culture, or like language, culture is transmitted through symbolic systems, is learned over time, and it is dynamic and changing. Think about, since we just read an article or a story about Shakespeare, a lot of people talk about how Shakespeare is the greatest poet and how much he gave the English language, how much he contributed to the English language. And as one of my professors put it, actually Sidney Mintz, he said that as much as Shakespeare gave the English language, it does not compare to what the English language gave to Shakespeare. This is to say that what we inherit, the enormous amount of cultural and language content which just comes to us, we cannot be functional human beings with that enormous amount of patterned activity which we learn from our society, our parents, our peers. So this leads us to the notion of linguistic relativity, which Guess associates with our old friend Franz Boas, one of the earliest US anthropologists. And what Boas was trying to do with the idea of linguistic relativity, in some ways, the idea of cultural relativity or cultural relativism, is to fight against the ideas of the time that languages could be ranked from the best and the most scientific languages like German, English, and French, and the idea that other languages were baby languages and they weren't really as sophisticated as the great languages. So Boas and other anthropologists, linguistic anthropologists, were interested in documenting different languages around the world. And they were also interested in documenting them because they were fighting against the language loss that was going on at the time, and in many ways is still going on today, where people give up or are forced out of their languages in preference for one of the more dominant languages. And so as anthropologists went around the world and documented different kinds of languages, we found that in contrast to the idea that certain languages were more sophisticated than others, it just depended on what people needed to do and wanted to do in the environment, the amount of things they would pay attention to. Like some people get really into potatoes. So a couple hundred words for potatoes. I will just say here that one of the reasons they may have so many different words for potatoes is because there are a lot of different kinds of potatoes in the Aymara. We usually have a few different kinds of potatoes, but they might have different varieties, different stages of growth, all kinds of different colors and shapes and sizes. We've standardized them over in Idaho. We got rid of all those and made it the russet, but they have lots of different potatoes in the homeland of potato domestication, Bolivia, Peru, that area of the Andes. So we can see a proliferation of words and a proliferation of concepts. And guest also discusses Bohannan here and Shakespeare in the Bush and in this text. And that's one of the reasons I wanted you to read that before you read his summation. But again, we can also see a difference of concept, a difficulty of translation, a absence of a concept like a ghost. And so you can have a proliferation of words for certain things that are important or an absence of words. Guest does discuss here what is sometimes referred to as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Edward Sapir, Benjamin Whorf were both linguists, both working around the time of Boas over 100 years ago. They shouldn't call it a hypothesis. It's really more like an idea. It can't be proven or disproven. It can't be falsified. But the idea is that language, in some ways, is crucial to how we perceive the world. And if we grow up in certain languages and have certain ideas, then it's going to change our perception of the world and influence the way we think. And so if we grow up with the idea that time is money and don't waste time, by the way, what does that turn time into? What does time become? Well, it becomes a commodity, but even more basic than that. If you can waste time, a resource, yeah, perhaps even more basic than a resource. What do we turn time into? Let me put it to you this way. How do I put it? Where is time? It turns it into a noun, something that you feel like you can have. Do you actually have time? You can't have time. Time isn't a noun. It's something that's just going on around us. The next thing you know, even calling it an it. I bring this up because Worf studied among the Hopi, for example, and they didn't have this sense of time as a noun, didn't have the same sense things could happen in what we call the past. Time was always present, because that's all we ever are, is in the present. Now, the problem with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is very difficult to prove or disprove, and the evidence is going to be impressionistic. Did the Hopi live in a timeless society just because they don't have the same words? Or are the Aymara really that great at perceiving different kinds of potatoes because they have more words? Or could you go there and if you spend a little time there, even if you didn't have the words for them, you could at least say, oh yeah, I can tell this potato from that potato. So it was always difficult here to know what was going on. Recently, some of the people in language labs have brought this back. Evidence, I would say, or they say, that this idea that language shapes thought is more provable or demonstrable than even Sapir-Whorf knew 100 years ago.